What's up, you guys? So in this video, I wanted to discuss some of the individuals or groups of individuals that influenced Darwin, which ultimately led him to come up with his big idea of evolution by natural selection, something that we'll talk in more depth in a later video. But some of those people, or groups of people who influenced him, are geologists such as James Hutton and Charles Lyell. We'll talk about both of them. We'll talk about Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, a biologist. We'll talk about Thomas Malthus, an economist, and we'll talk about breeders. So all of these individuals or groups of individuals helped shape Darwin's ideas, which ultimately led him to develop his big idea of evolution by natural selection. So let's talk about the geologists first. James Hutton, he came first in the order of living. James Hutton lived between 1726 and 1797. He was a geologist who studied mountain ranges and erosion. I'll put his picture on the screen, but he studied these mountain ranges, how mountains form and how erosion shapes the mountains, and at that time, people only thought that the Earth was a few thousand years old. Now, he said that that can't be possible because mountain ranges and erosion, for all of this to occur, we need a much, much longer amount of time. So he didn't necessarily give a specific amount of time, but he coined this phrase, deep time. So instead of just a few thousand years, we're talking maybe hundreds of thousands of years, maybe millions. He doesn't know, but he basically just said deep time. Now, along comes this other geologist. So James Hutton died 1797. Charles Lyell was born 1797, and he studied volcanoes mainly, or he's most famous for studying volcanoes and how the formation, when volcanoes erupt, they release lava, the lava creates new land masses, and in order for this process to occur, another geological process, you would need millions of years. So he said that the Earth has to be millions of years old at least. Nowadays, we predict that the Earth is roughly 4.5 billion years old, but at that time, these geologists coming out and saying that the Earth is much older than we previously thought, that tells Darwin, or that gives Darwin the idea, that if the Earth is so old, then evolution has enough time to occur. Biological evolution takes millions of years to occur. It's a very, very slow process. So if the Earth was only 6,000 years old, as was previously predicted, or 10,000 years old, that's not enough time for biological evolution to occur. But if it's millions of years old, now we're working with something. Now we can say that if the Earth is that old, evolution, organisms changing over time, that super, super slow process, could have occurred. So that was Darwin's ideas, or that's how those geologists influenced Darwin, saying that the Earth is much older than previously anticipated, and if it's old, evolution can occur. Now, this idea of evolution was not something new. Biologists before Darwin were saying that organisms are or have been changing over time. If you just look at the fossil record, you can see that organisms that existed in the past don't exist today. So, and the organisms that exist today, we don't find fossils of those organisms far, far in the past. So this idea of biological evolution was not something new for Darwin. For instance, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck was a biologist who said that species evolve over time. He's most famous for discussing the evolution of giraffes. So for instance, the giraffe history, if you look at the fossil record, giraffes haven't always had super, super long necks. They've had shorter necks as you go further back in history, and you see that their necks get longer and longer over time. So this idea that species change over time wasn't something new, but the explanation of how they change over time was still yet to be described and accepted. So Jean-Baptiste Lamarck took a shot at it. He said that, okay, if we have these giraffes, it's possible that the earliest giraffes started reaching their necks or stretching their necks to get these high up leaves that only they could reach, and then after a while their neck would gradually stretch out, and then when they have children, those children would now have a longer neck. And now those children would stretch their necks to reach up towards the higher leaves, and then as they get a slightly longer neck, they'll pass that off to their kids. Now, this was not readily accepted because this is like saying that if you get a tattoo on your arm and you have a child, that child is now going to have a tattoo. So he was saying that acquired characteristics, acquired traits that you get throughout your lifetime, like a stretched out neck, is going to be passed on to the next generation. And that's just not true. So you might hang on monkey bars and stretch out your arms, which I believe Michael Jordan actually did do. But that doesn't mean that when Michael Jordan has children, those children are now going to have longer arms. So all of this was not accepted. So the idea of evolution was not something new for Darwin, but the explanation of how things changed over time, that had yet to be accepted, an acceptable explanation of how organisms evolve. So Jean-Baptiste Lamarck said acquired traits, you get them throughout your lifetime, and then you pass them off to your offspring. In general, he was wrong. And he lived between 1744 and 1849. So just towards the beginning of Darwin's life, he was an adult. Now, let's talk about Thomas Malthus. So let me slide over a little bit more. So Thomas Malthus was an economist, and so you don't typically think that an economist would have any influence on Darwin's ideas of evolution by natural selection. But Thomas Malthus was an English economist, and he basically studied populations, human populations. And he said that as humans were growing, he was seeing that the population was expanding. We were having more births than deaths. And eventually he predicted that this would not be sustainable. That over time, humans would start dying off due to the quicker spread of diseases, due to the limited resources that the earth has, or that the immediate land has for those humans. So he basically said that the population is growing, and there are going to be limiting factors that keep the population from growing at that rate. So Darwin said, well, if Thomas Malthus says this could happen with humans, what's to say it cannot happen in nature? Where, if you take a mosquito, for example, mosquitoes have tons and tons of offspring, but not all of those offspring are going to be able to survive. There's not enough resources. There are predators out there. So there are a lot of other limiting factors that are going to keep the mosquitoes at bay, right? So this kind of gives the impression that only the most fit organisms will survive, which we'll talk about in the next unit, or in the next video, sorry. But that's Thomas Malthus saying that there are limiting factors on human population growth. And so if there are limiting factors on human population growth, this is probably even more the case in nature with other species, other populations. So that's Thomas Malthus. And then finally, I wanted to talk about breeders. So Darwin's idea of evolution by natural selection really came or derived from the influence of this other concept, which was artificial selection. So artificial selection, artificial basically means not natural. And so artificial selection was something that breeders had been doing for thousands of years before Darwin. For instance, he talked about dogs. So dogs, if you are not aware, came initially from wolves. So there was one species of wolf that became domesticated by humans. And over time, what breeders did was they took wolves that had certain characteristics and they only bred them. So for instance, if you wanted to create something like a pug, right? A pug has a short face, a short snout. It's very small. So let's say we have the first wolf. It has a bunch of offspring, right? Those offspring are going to look a little bit different. Like if you have siblings, you probably look a little bit different than your siblings. So the offspring, the children of this parent wolf, are all going to look a little bit different. And so if you're trying to get a pug, you basically take whichever wolf, whichever offspring has the shortest snout and perhaps is the smallest, and then you only breed that particular wolf, and you don't breed the other ones, right? And then over time, you find out of that wolf's offspring, whichever wolf happens to have the shortest snout in that group, you only breed that one, and whichever one happens to be the smallest, you only breed that one. And over time, after generation after generation after generation, what you're going to see is what we originally had was a wolf. We are eventually going to have its descendant, its great-great-great-great-great-grandson, ends up being super, super small with a super short snout. And that's due to human intervention. Humans only breeding the ones that had short snouts and that are small in general. So Darwin said that if this can happen artificially, artificial selection, where humans are choosing what traits get passed down, if this can happen artificially, it could also happen naturally in nature. But perhaps humans aren't the ones that choose what trait gets passed down, but rather nature. Nature chooses based on whichever trait happens to allow that organism to survive, and if the organism survives, it passes on its trait. So we're going to talk about this. We're going to talk about this more in another video, Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, but those are the big influencers. So the geologists, James Hutton and Charles Lyell, the biologist, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, Thomas Malthus, the English economist, and breeders, breeders who ultimately practiced artificial selection over thousands of years. So hopefully that was helpful, and if you have any questions, leave them down in the comment section, send me an email, any of those work. So I will see you in the next video.